Yeah, we're talking about cryogenics and cryonic preservation of life, so people can actually wake up in the future. Like the concept is kind of like good, but when you actually think it through, like, is it even feasible?
2014, and the Alcor Life Extension Foundation is receiving a new client. You can't call this person a patient, however, as they are deceased. Foundation workers are preparing the corpse. But it's not what you think. The body isn't going to be buried or cremated, but instead preserved for a future potential reanimation. The body will be stored alongside other corpses from relatively unknown to celebrities, including the longest surviving Cryonics body. They're all placed here for a potential future where their final moments on Earth may actually have not yet happened. This new customer for the
Yeah, if this technology is actually like feasible and so everybody's going to cash in on that, like 100% sure. Like,
Alcor Life Extension Foundation falls in the middle between famous and unknown. The body they are preparing is someone called Hal Finney, who had sadly died of complications from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. He was a computer engineer, and although potentially unknown, he was the first recipient of a Bitcoin transaction from the cryptocurrency creator Satoshi Nakamoto.
yeah,
Many
how is
have
out
even
there?
posited that Finney was the famous white paper author himself. But today we aren't looking at Bitcoin, but instead the process of cryonics, the preservation of the dead so that one day they may live again. Its critics will call it a pseudoscience that takes money in exchange for false hope. As to date, no method of bringing back those who have been preserved has arisen. But regardless of its criticisms, the field has filtered its way into the cultural zeitgeist of the 20th century. My name is John, and this is the dark side of science. Our story starts on the 26th of July 1919 in Letchworth, Hertfordshire, United Kingdom, with the birth of one of Cryonics' first theoreticians, James Lovelock. He was brought up in a Quaker household, which would have an influence throughout his life and working career. His family moved to London during his school years, where he would attend the Strand School. His family, not being the most wealthy, could not afford to send their son to university. Upon completion of school, he went out to work for a photography company. During this time, he attended evening school at Birkbeck College, but eventually he would be able to afford to attend the University of Manchester to study chemistry. His time at university would be set to the backdrop of the Second World War, and his studies allowed him a deferral from enlistment. But although personally a conscientious objector, he undertook research council work into the effect of sunburn, the results of which were used to help protect soldiers in hot climates. Post-war, Lovelock would earn his PhD in medicine at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. From there, he carved out a career at London's National Institute for Medical Research. In the early 1950s, Lovelock started looking into the field of cryopreservation, that is, freezing organic material to stop any chemical processes. This is not as simple as it sounds. You see, freezing can actually cause damage to organic matter. This is from the water within crystallizing. This is not much of an issue.
Yeah, it is like truly science fiction. Like, I don't think that this actually much more feasible and actually works in the grand scheme of things. It is still regarded as science fiction.
With freezing last night's lasagna. But if the thing you're looking to preserve is more delicate, then these crystals can cause damage to the cell membranes. This is where cryoprotectants come into play, but we'll come back to this in a little bit. Okay, I should probably pause here to say Lovelock wasn't the first, as French biologist Jean Rostand had looked into storing organic material at low temperatures before, as well as the concept of keeping a person in a frozen state or suspended animation to prolong life was around in fiction even as far back as the 500s in folk stories. Even in science fiction, for example Mary Shelley's Roger Dodsworth, the reanimated Englishman. But Lovelock seemed to me like a good place to start this video. In 1953, Lovelock released the paper Hemolysis of Human Red Blood Cells by Freezing and Thawing. In this, he suggested that the concentration of electrolytes, most notably salts, is the damaging factor when blood is frozen and subsequently thawed. Meanwhile, in the US, the first children were conceived from previously frozen sperm in 1954, when 3 women successfully gave birth to 3 healthy children.
Damn.
Lovelock looked to further study the field of cryopreservation, and in 1956, he released another paper, Studies on Golden Hamsters during cooling to and rewarming from body temperatures below 0 degrees centigrade. Here, Lovelock and fellow National Institute for Medical Research colleague Audrey U. Smith looked into the freezing and thawing of golden hamsters. They did this in order to observe the amount of water in the brain that could be frozen and still achieve consciousness upon being defrosted. In this experiment, it was found that many, at least 1/3 of their test subjects, survived with up to 60% of the water in their brains having been frozen at a temperature between minus 0.5 degrees and minus 1 degree centigrade. This paved the
Bro, imagine your brain fluid just getting frozen and shit, like...
way for thinking that a human brain could be cryopreserved. But the study did highlight issues with other parts of the hamster's body, where other organs in the animal were more susceptible to freezing damage. This brings us back to cryoprotectants and their unlikely discovery. Lovelock's colleague, Audrey U. Smith, had been working throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s with Sir Alan Parkes and Christopher Polge to develop a reliable cryopreservation technique for animal semen. Unfortunately, their studies had hit a bit of a brick wall until a chance discovery. Smith had, during her experiments, experienced a success using albumin, but bizarrely she couldn't replicate the results. Strange. She went back to the same bottle she had used in the successful run, as in subsequent attempts with a different bottle had failed. She went back to the bottle she had the success with, but sadly, it was accidentally dropped. Some of the unknown liquid splashed on a lab
What's up with that, bro? Like...
hot plate, and a pungently acrid smell puff of smoke was given off. Smith recognised the smell, acrolein, which is given off when glycerol is burnt. Ah, that must be it, she thought. Smith subsequently tested glycerol and proved consistent success. This chance discovery had created an important milestone in cryopreservation. But how does a cryoprotectant work? Cryoprotectants are chemicals that dissolve in and lower the melting point of water, creating larger unfrozen pockets for cells that reduce damage from freezing. The use of Lovelock's and Smith's discoveries hadn't really been considered for the freezing of the dead yet. Enter American Robert Ettinger, the man who had pushed the field towards freezing humans in hope of future reanimation. He found interest in cryonics from a fiction background. He had read at the age of 12 the 1931 36-page short story called The Jameson Satellite. The story tells of a future race of machine men called the Zoromes, who discover a spaceship orbiting Earth. On board, they discover a Professor Jameson, a man who had died 40 million years before. He had sent his corpse into space to preserve it for eternity to orbit around the Earth. The machine men decide to place Jameson's brain in a machine body, and the Professor lives once more. The story would stay with Ettinger throughout his teens and 20s, where he served in the US Army, being severely wounded fighting in Germany. Unquestionably, this experience would force him to question his own mortality. Post-war, Ettinger would earn 2 master's degrees and would become a high school teacher. But that science fiction story he read in the 1930s would stay in his mind. Its story of rebirth after a period of preservation would bring a case of life imitating art, when a 42-year-old Ettinger wrote a few pages on the concept of cryonics and sent it to a number of influential people in American society. Few responded, but undeterred, Ettinger set out to further develop his concept in the privately published 1962 book, The Prospects of Immortality. This time around, the book attracted more attention than his previous paper, and it was passed to a publisher who in turn consulted the concept with Isaac Asimov. Meanwhile, during 1963, Peter Mazur at Oak Ridge National Laboratory posited that cell damage could be reduced in the speed in which the organic material was frozen. He theorized that a speed of 1 degree centigrade per minute was all that was needed to greatly reduce damage, as long as the item had been treated with glycerol or some similar cryoprotectant. The science was starting to seem like it could fit the concept, and it wasn't long before the first human body would be preserved. Ettinger's book inspired several cryopreservation companies in the US, which would lead to the first attempt at preserving a human body. The first person to be frozen still remains unknown, but what is known is that it was performed by Cryocare Equipment Corporation in Phoenix, Arizona. The company was advertising deep freezing as a form of cosmetic preservation, but in April 1966, the first person was frozen with the rough concept of reanimation in mind. The middle-aged woman from the Los Angeles area was placed in liquid nitrogen 2 months after being embalmed. She was stored at slightly above freezing temperatures in a mortuary refrigerator, but the body would only be kept for a year or so before she was thawed out and buried. But it wouldn't be until another year later that the first person was officially cryogenically preserved. James Hiram Bedford was a psychology professor, and before his demise had written into his will his desire for the care for his corpse.
Are these people even actually real? Like,
After death.
who in the right now would actually want to get frozen? Like, unless you have nothing to actually do on Earth.
He even wrote in $100,000 to be donated to Cryonics. On the 12th of January 1967, Bedford died of cardiorespiratory arrest as a result of his metastasized kidney cancer. Within 2 hours, the preservation process began. His body was injected with a solution of 15% dimethyl sulfide and 85% Ringer's solution, which pre-invention of vitrification was once thought to be useful for long-term cryogenics, but it is unlikely the process preserved the brain. The preservation work was conducted by Robert Prehoda, an early cryonics proponent, Robert Nelson, a former TV repairman, and a Dr. Dante Bruno, a physician and biophysicist. Bedford's first couple of years were stored at the Edward Hope cryocare facility. But Hope's dream of financial success didn't come to fruition. After 2 years, Hope looked to get shot of his frozen clients and started offloading them to other organisations and family members. Bedford's body would bounce around from facility to facility. By now, Robert Nelson had founded the Cryonics Society of California, and through this, he would freeze several more corpses. In 1969, Nelson would put 4 bodies inside a capsule made for one. He purchased an underground vault at a cemetery in Chatsworth on the northwest side of Los Angeles. In May 1970, the capsule with 4 corpses in was lowered into the vault, but the bodies were allowed to thaw when the money ran out for Nelson. Nelson would continue freezing bodies and taking payment for storage. If a family stopped paying, then he'd stop topping up liquid nitrogen, which allowed thawing and eventual decomposition. In total, 7 bodies at Nelson's crypt would thaw out, and needless to say, the carelessness would result in a court case against the organisation, which, unsurprisingly for Nelson and his business partner, resulted in a fine of nearly $1 million in 1981. Bedford's body was luckily not amongst those at the ill-fated Chatsworth crypt, and eventually custody of the corpse went to Alcor, where it is today. The custody chain of Bedford's body and the disaster of Nelson's cryonics operation further highlights the inherent issues with the concept, as the corpse is entirely at the whim of the place it is stored in. Bedford's story is vitally important to the cryonics journey, as he is the only corpse to remain frozen and thus potentially recoverable pre-1974, though the whole brain thing does raise questions to what they would be reviving. But since the early 1970s, cryonics has made improvements with newer methods of preservation. And now this leads us pretty neatly onto how a body is prepared for storage after death in the more modern day. Say you want to be preserved for a future where you will live again. Well, you have roughly 2 options. 1, preservation of your whole body, or 2, preservation of just your brain. You see, the studies by Lovelock.
I think the brain option is much more feasible. Like, you can actually put a brain in a fucking vat and actually live longer. Well, you know, you can use some kind of like an embryo fucking shit, like make it under a body and put the brain inside. Like, that's feasible.
In the 1950s, highlighted the need for reducing the buildup of ice crystals within cells. We also saw with Lovelock's and Smith's work, cryoprotectants and a slowing rate of cooling work towards this. But one great leap forward was the use of vitrification. Vitrification makes the use of cryoprotectants, which replace the blood. This reduces the risk of crystallization and turns the organ vitrified into a solid glass-like state. Great, you might say, no ice crystals for me. However, there is one drawback. It is not suitable for a whole body preservation, and thus this process is only used on neuropreservation, that is, just the brain. With a brain preservation, you're really hoping for some kind of conscious upload, or, like in Jameson's satellite, a machine body. It probably goes without saying that freezing your brain is significantly cheaper than a whole body preservation. But how about getting your whole body done? Well, let's have a look next. Clearly, thinking of one's mortality is a troubling thought process. Some have more time to think about this than others. The cryonics process.
But I believe like these kinds of experimentations are done behind, like, some kind of like intelligence agencies or some behind military agencies. They actually done these kinds of operations, like it's swapping our brains and shit. They probably would have done this shit, like, on the name of advancement of sciences, and it probably they were never released to the public, but they probably should have done, done these kinds of activities, like behind closed doors, 100%.
Procedure heavily relies on the time of death being predictable, and as such, most who are preserved have died of a terminal disease, and not in some sudden accident. With cryonics, preparation is key, and as such, in the days leading up to death, a standby team is required to be on call to start work at the exact moment of death. Now, because most countries don't allow euthanasia, this requires a lot of waiting around on the part of the standby team. Upon the moment of cardiac arrest, legal death, the standby team starts the preservation process. You see, the quicker the work begins, the more of the cells can remain intact. The body's breathing and circulation are artificially restarted to reduce the damage to the brain, and to start the intravenous delivery of cryoprotective medications. The body is placed in an ice water bath for transportation to the preservation facility. Once successfully transported, more cryoprotectants are perfused into the body. For around a week, the body is then gradually cooled down to a temperature of nearly minus 200 degrees centigrade, and in theory, is now safe from deterioration. Thus, the dying process is now apparently paused. But here we still have the inherent risk of cryonics. Not the cooling process, as science has caught up with ambition, but the storing process. The body needs to be kept at this low temperature, and this is not cheap. It is estimated that a minimum of at least $200,000 is needed for the preservation process. This consists of $60,000 for the process, $25,000 into a membership fund, and the remaining $115,000
futures not for poor people, like, that's obvious.
Into a trust that owns the mortgage on the storage facility, as well as a yearly membership fee when the patient is still alive. At least that's how Alcor Foundation operates. Now, needless to say, with large amounts of money needed and the concept of dodging death, cryonics does have its criticisms. To date, no one has been brought back to life, and there are no plans for the time being. The processes used, however, have proven themselves to work, such as vitrification, where it is used in preserving embryos, with children being successfully born from their deep frozen origins. And reportedly, a rabbit's brain was frozen and thawed with no crystallization damage observed. But the whole concept does raise some ethical concerns. For example, the increased risk of potential premature euthanasia, potential mental anguish.
Some ethical concerns. This whole shit raises an entire ethical concern of morality itself.
To the families of the deceased, and the changing of the concept of death. The technology to revive the frozen corpses does not yet exist, let alone being able to cure the deceased of whatever deceased them in the first place. But the main question that comes to my mind is, would you even want to come back to life, presumably many years in the future? After all, everyone you knew and loved has long since perished.
Yeah,
It would
and what if you actually wake up and there's a fucking robot animation? Like, what the fuck is the point of actually, like, preserving your life? Like,
be lonely, and you would be an alien in another world. Say, for instance, your great-great-great-grandfather was frozen and thawed out today.
but this would be like a introvert Sarah Loner's dream, like, to be a guinea pig in cryopreservation. If it actually is successful, like, you can actually wake up in the future and, like...
Would he be able to adopt to modern technology? My nan, in...
But I also think the future's kind of bleak. Like, we're in the golden age. Like, future's much more dark. That's what I imagine.
1920s Sligo Island didn't even have running water in the house she grew up in. And within her lifetime, technology went from gas lights to the internet. And this brings us back to 2014 and the preparation of how. Will he be revived sometime in the future? Well, we may never know. But if going on Cryonics' history is anything to predict the future on, possibly unlikely. But Alcor have seemed to deal with the long-term financial issues in a sensible manner by using the money paid by the internee to invest in future income. But the critics are not in short supply. In a 2015 MIT Technology Review article called The False Science of Cryonics, looked into the claims of cryonics companies being able to upload your brain in the future, and it was thought that this would be very unlikely. The field is not considered a medical treatment, and to me falls more into the realm of pseudoscience.
Yeah, also, like, that's into transhumanism, but it's still, like, science fiction.
But how unethical cryonics is will really fall down to whether you think that taking a fee for an unproven process with no yet successful outcome for any test subject is ethical or not. I suppose most of the frozen thought that cryonics might offer some hope in the face of death, and as such, it seems like it is just a very expensive way of coping with one's mortality. Clearly, early cryonics organisations were well beyond the mark in terms of holding people's remains almost like ransom, but more modern organisations seem to have learnt from these past blunders. But cryonics does have an important cultural impact, especially in science fiction films where people are put into suspended animation in order to travel to different galaxies. The man who brought cryonics into the public mind, Ettinger, would himself be frozen after death in 2011. Now, where would you rate this subject on my ethical scale? 1 being no problems at all, and 10 being pure evil. I'm going to rate it between 2 and 4. This is due to most people involved having informed consent, and apart from it costing a lot of money, it doesn't seem to, at least in the modern day, be involved in testing on living subjects. This is Plain Difficult Production. All videos on the channel.
Yeah, but I think they're, like, actually making attempts, you know, to actually do this.
This is Alcor's patient care bay. This is where we have all our patients stored, currently 199 humans, plus almost 100 pets. So they're not really dead, they're just legally dead. They're not biologically dead, obviously, because you can donate all kinds of organs that are still viable and keep other people alive. It just means that something critical has failed that we can't fix today. We come at the stage where doctors today have given up, where today's medicine and technology is not sufficient to keep you going. But we're saying, instead of just disposing of the patient, give them to us, we're going to stabilize them, stop them getting worse, and hold them for as long as it takes for technology to catch up and allow them to come back to life and continue living.
Bro, that's an idealistic pipe dream, bro.
So each patient is wrapped first of all in a sleeping bag to protect them in case we have to move them to soak up liquid nitrogen. Then they're put inside this aluminum pod where they're secured in there, so they have mechanical protection. And then they're secured in these. So these things being made of aluminum are very good temperature conductors. They're very much like people in a long-term coma, except there's no metabolism. So to them, no time is passing. They're not alive because obviously there's no metabolism, not functioning, not moving around. So people say, well, if they're not alive, they must be dead. Well, no, there's kind of an in-between state, which is not really alive or dead. So in our view, dying is a...
But that one statement made it clear this guy's full of bullshit, bro. Like, he said alive, not dead, bro. What the fuck are you talking about?
Process, and cryonics stops that process. It puts dying on a
Yeah, this whole field is of pseudoscience.
Pause and lets you go into the future where we have greater capabilities to reverse that and bring you back to life. The first stage of the procedure, we have to wait until the patient's been declared legally dead. We then move the patient from the bed into this ice bath, and we're going to cover them in ice and add some water Obviously, we don't have that here, but we're going to use this device called the squid to circulate icy water around the patient. That accelerates the cooling, the external cooling. At the same time, we're going to apply a mechanical CPR device. It's much more efficient and less tiring than manual CPR, and a respirator. First of all, we have to circulate blood around the patient, otherwise the heat won't get moved around, and we want to get heat out of the brain especially, so we have to circulate that around. And also we're going to give a series of medications to protect the cells against damage. So we're going to stop the patient from returning to consciousness, number one. We're going to stop the blood from clotting. We're going to keep the blood pressure up. All these things we have to do to maintain viability, much as you do when you're donating organs. The one in the middle is by far our youngest patient, not quite 3 years old, a little girl from Thailand who had brain cancer. Both her parents were doctors, and she had multiple brain surgeries, and nothing worked, unfortunately. So they contacted us. Because they were actually medical professionals, they actually set up an operating room in Thailand, and we could send a team out there and do the procedure we'd normally do locally. When people talk about cryonics, they often say, well, you guys freeze people. And that's not really accurate, because freezing really implies the formation of ice crystals. And that's something we want to avoid, because ice does damage to cells. So we don't want to freeze the patient, we want to vitrify them. Once you cool to very cold below freezing, the solution, instead of crystallizing, will just get thicker and thicker, and it's like a glassy block holding all the cells in place without any internal structure, and so does no damage. And once we reach that point, which happens around minus 110 degrees C or so, once that's happened, the body becomes a true solid. And
yeah, I don't buy that. It's not Star Wars. Like, you cannot vitrify an actual body, like, and expect it to work.
Absolutely nothing is happening in the body.
How does that even make sense?
There's no biochemical activity whatsoever, certainly no neurological activity. So at that point, really, it doesn't matter whether you wait a day or 100 years, you're going to be just the same as when you started. So some of the cooling takes place in that box, but then the final cool down will take place in this smaller dewar here. Again, the patient's in the aluminum pod, so we can just hook that up, open up our roof, winch them up, move them along, and then straight down into one of these other containers for long-term storage. For the whole body, it's a minimum of $200,000, which if you look at the cost of open heart surgery is really pretty low. Just for the brain alone is $80,000, and those are minimums. And a big chunk of that money is put aside to keep you cryopreserved for the long term.
The only group that you really see getting excited about the possibility are people who are people who specialize in studying the distant future, or people who have a stake in wanting you to pay the money to do it. I don't really see any mainstream brain scientists, physiologists, people from psychiatry who study the mind. They're not lining up saying, I think this is a sound idea. Moreover, I don't think any of them do it. So at the end of the day, I think
all these cryo-freeze companies are fucking bullshit.
This notion of free,
they're just scamming people for money, like 200,000, like, for shit that doesn't even work. Like, who are you fucking scamming, bro?
freezing ourselves into the future is pretty science fiction, and it's naive. It's almost like what you'd be thinking about in a college dormitory discussion. If I could just freeze myself and then defrost myself, kind of like a bag of peas, and wind up way in the future, wouldn't that be cool? Sounds okay, but then you realize how much we are products of our own time.
Come on, boy. Come on, you can jump. Okay, wait, jump. Woohoo! Our dog, Oscar, here he is, right here. He was almost 15 years old when he became ill, and he was suspended, put in cryonics. I think that in the future, the people who opted in for human cryopreservation or human cryonics preservation or human cryonics preservation
Bro, look at her. These are the audience. These are the consumers of this product, like this service.
For human cryopreservation.
Makes sense. It's only the loonies would actually like do this kind of shit.
Or human cryonics preservation will most likely have family members and or friends who have also signed up for cryonics. And then it's just a waiting period. It's like, you're in flight, you're in transport to your destination, and the destination would be the future, where a person who had a cancer or ALS or some other type of injury or disease is revived, the disease or injury cured or fixed, and the person has a new body cloned or a whole body prosthetic or their body reanimated. And meet up with their friends again. People wondered, is this a human? And the same type of criticism is often reflected on cryonics. They won't be human when they're revived, or who will they be? Will they remember themselves? And what, you know, it'll be a frightening world. I don't think so.
Yeah, all these cryonics companies are fucking bullshit. Like, it's fucking pseudoscience. Don't trust any developments in field of cryonics or cryogenics ever. Like, it's just fucking scam. $200,000, bro. Like, just stop.